I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I'm really excited to talk about the novel we're going to be talking about today, Sister Maiden Monster. But before I do that, really quickly, just a shout out for some of the things that are coming up on this podcast. We're going to be discussing Heinlein's 1940s classic, The Roads Must Roll, for our series on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. But also, I am returning to the Midwest, where Lucy is currently, to my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana, on April 7th for the book launch for my science fiction novel, People's Park, which takes place in Bloomington. And if you notice anything about the date, it's the day before the solar eclipse. So you can come to Indiana and experience that. And in Bloomington, we have the honor of all the festivities for the solar eclipse are being hosted by William Shatner. So it's a cool place to be. It's a cool science fictional nerdy trip you can take. But anyways, that's it for the shameless promotions. But if you want to buy a special edition for People's Park, I'm doing all these extra bonus features. You can buy it directly from me, or you can just get it from the usual suspects after April. So hit me up if you want to buy one of the special editions. So today, my guest is Lucy Snyder, who I have read a bunch of her short fiction before, here and there, in various things. But this is my first time reading one of Lucy's novels, admittedly. And so I'm going to fix that in the near future because I had such a great time with this book. Lucy, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Oh, thank you for having me here.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm overdue reading one of your novels. I've always been impressed by the short stories that I've read. So this book was already on my list. And as I told you the story, I got it in an impulse checkout at the library because my students sat down in front of the brand new bookshelf and it was there. And I said to myself, oh, I've been meaning to read that. And even though my TBR is crazy, I put it to the top and was really excited to read it. But before we get into this book, why don't we give people a little bit of, and I'm apologizing to the people who are watching this on YouTube. I'm suddenly getting blasted by sun and I'm trying to block it as best I can. But how did you get into genre fiction and writing? Like, what's your origin story? Let's start there.
Well, I when I was a kid, a young kid, I started reading science fiction and fantasy pretty early, and it really caught my imagination. I didn't actually start reading horror until I was an adult. And the reason for that is I've had chronic nightmares pretty much my entire life, and if I consumed anything horror related, it would just make that so much worse, like just way, 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 way worse. Um, like I ended up getting dragged by friends to go see Cronenberg's The Fly when I was a teenager. And yeah, that movie stuck with me for a really
Hmm.
long time. Uh, but so anyway, I was a lover of science fiction and fantasy, and so I started trying to write my own stories, but they were coming out weird. They were coming out really weird. And when I was in college, I was like, okay, Snyder, you're writing horror, you need to actually sit down and become familiar with the genre and kind of get your ducks aligned, because clearly what you're writing is not going to be fun little science fiction and fantasy stories that are going to be straightforward and not at all dark. So yeah, that's kind of what happened.
Well, and when we get further into this book, we're going to talk about its science fictional aspects because obviously, in my review of this book, I focused a lot on the distinction of science fiction and horror being a crossover feature, not a bug of this book.
Hmm.
And one of the things about that, I should also say that if you trust me to that I when I tell you this is a weird and totally amazing science fiction book, I went into it cold. I did not read anything on the back.
Okay.
I went purely on all those Stoker awards over your shelf and said, and that I've been meaning to read a full length work of yours for a long time. So I went into it cold and I had a really great experience not knowing what was going to come. And eventually in this conversation, we're going to go full spoilers because that's what we
Okay.
do around here. But so I'm going to give you two warnings, listeners. This one is the warning for if you don't want to know anything about this book and you trust me, pause this interview and come back. I'll give you another warning for the absolute, like, total spoiler part. But for this point, we're going to go like dust jacket, what's on there, what, promotional stuff. So Sister Maiden Monster, was this book written before or after the start? I mean, obviously it got an edit after COVID, but was it written before COVID or during or after? Because this is definitely a COVID anxiety book. It seems like.
Well, it's based on a couple of short stories that came out before COVID. The first story was Magdala Amygdala, which won the Stoker Award, and it's been my most frequently anthologized short story. And that came out about over 10 years ago at this point. The first place it appeared was the Dark Faith anthology that was
Mm,
edited by Maurice Broaddus. Uh, and then a couple of years later, I wrote a short story called My Knowing Glance uh, that came out in a different anthology. And when I was pitching ideas to my editor at Tor, she was like, "Oh, yeah, I would definitely like an expansion of Magdala Amygdala. Everybody loves that short story." I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." So when I was fully writing it, lockdown had happened. We were fully in the midst of the pandemic. And so that certainly informed the writing of the novel. There were aspects to Magdala Amygdala that I realized I needed to expand on, and some things that I hadn't taken into account, like, for instance, masks. Like, there's not a mask to be seen in Magdala Amygdala.
yeah.
And I was like, well, that's clearly got to be a thing with this. So,
Right. Well, and another way that makes this book science fictional is the long tradition of the fix-up novel that comes from the short story that everybody loved. That, yeah, expand on that, like, give me more. And I did not know that origin of this novel, and that makes a lot of sense. And so you got to really to take one of your most popular ideas and kind of reinvigorate it, like, when you started this process, like, obviously the masks were one thing, but what were some of the things that you were most excited to return to from this story?
well, for one thing, Gregory is a pretty major, he's a major character in the first part of the book, but also he's an important kind of recurring character throughout because he has an impact on all three narrators. But he was Mr. Not appearing actually in this short story in Magdala Amygdala. Like, there's a reference to a boyfriend, and then he never shows up in the story. And I thought, well, that's going to be a relationship that's going to matter a lot more to Aaron in this version. I want to kind of see how Gregory is an unwitting instigator of a lot of stuff. And another thing was exploring the beginnings of the relationship with Betty that Aaron has.
Well,
And
and
also, go on.
no, so for me, one of the things, okay, my favorite subgenre of fiction of any kind is the weird apocalypse. And so that's one of the reasons why this book was hardwired for me. And so one of the things about this is when I went into it cold, I didn't know what it was. And so once I figured out what was going on, I was like, oh, this is great. But there's a cosmic horror level to some of the things that are going on, and maybe that's something we're going to reserve for later in the conversation. However, the kind of like the thought experiments that you get to do with this story, like you wrote the original short story 10 years ago, but you must have
Mhm.
been thinking about this world throughout. It must have been a thing that, you kind of had cooking, I would imagine, for a long time, right?
Well, I mean, I've been thinking about the world on and off, but I didn't think about it really, really in depth until basically Kelly gave me the green light to go ahead and do the novelization. And part of that is kind of my own process that I'm I'm mostly a plotter, but I'm also partly a discovery writer. And sort of the process of thinking more deeply about this world was kind of what drove me through the novel, if that makes sense. Like that was what kept it, fresh and interesting to me because I feel like if I've been thinking about it for the past 10 years, kind of nonstop, it would be kind of like, I feel like I've already done that even though I haven't.
Mhm. No, I
Does
see
that
what
make
you're
sense?
saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what people should know about how the narrative is set up is that there is basically three parts or three interconnected novellas that all kind of have a different POV or narrator. They make one collective piece and they weave together in very uh, excellent ways. But I think it's a feature of what makes this novel interesting is that you have these three voices, and I, me personally, I could see why I I liked the first two. The first novella was very heartbreaking. All right. And I was very emotionally connected to it. The second one I felt was very transgressive. And the third one was super strange. And I could see how some people might think that those tonal shifts were challenging, but to me that was what really made the book fun and interesting, is that it had three different feels, whereas the story all comes together. And I thought that was a neat magic trick narratively. Was that planned, or did that come out of the discovery process?
It was mostly planned. I knew kind of what structure I wanted to take because again, I had these two different short stories. Sort of like, well, I've got Aaron's most of Aaron's story and I've got part of Savannah's story. Where are these stories going to intersect? And then I realized that for sort of the part that was going to bring everything together, I needed to come up with a brand new character who is Mareva, who's the viewpoint character for part three, and she ends up being the catalyst for the other characters coming together and for what eventually happens in the novel. um, I definitely went into this wanting to do something different because there are some very specific plot structures and story structures that you find in genre fiction, where X is supposed to happen here, Y is supposed to happen here, Z is supposed to happen here, boy meets girl, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't really want to do that. Like, I wanted something that was going to keep people guessing as long as possible about what they had in their hands. And that works for some people, it doesn't work for others. If people go in there expecting, I hesitate to use the word formulaic, but I mean, that's what you think of, that
Mhm.
there's some novels that adhere to a very specific structure. And to me, that's not a sin. Like it's, the difference between free verse and writing a sestina. Like a sestina has all kinds of rules and requirements and things have to hit exactly where they hit. um, but it's sort of like some people come into this novel, which I view more like as being sort of a different form of free verse. If you're comparing it to that, and they were expecting a sestina or they were expecting a sonnet, they were expecting something that was going to conform to a different kind of narrative structure, a different type of character structure than what I was doing. So,
Yeah, and really it comes together very nicely, and we'll talk about when we get to spoilers about how some of them just like really hit, like the reveals just really worked for me, and it was very well done. I think one of the things too that really makes this book feel like a nightmare in all the right ways is that and I compared it in my review positively to The Girl with All the Gifts because I thought that the thing that made that book special was that it was taking on somewhat of a common apocalypse story that we've seen in horror and did it in a different way. And but most importantly was the emotional richness of this. And the reason why I think this book becomes such nightmare fuel for people is because from the beginning, Erin, who's our narrator for the first act, um, we meet her on a very special night of her life,
Hmm.
and it kind of all goes to shit there. Was was that a new invention or was that a part of the short story? Because I think that was the hook that really made the first part so heartbreaking.
That was a new addition. The short story starts after she's separated from Gregory and has already started her relationship with Betty.
Mhm.
So the novel starts much earlier. I figured out, okay, like when do things go off the rails for her? And I figured, okay, let's go back to the night where she first gets infected and gets sick and has to go to the hospital. And I thought, well, how can I set that up? Let's take the standard happily ever after ending that you would find in the ending of a romance novel and just have it go completely off the rails.
Right. And what makes the or one of the most chilling scenes in the book, which I highlighted in my review, is when Erin first figures out that she has this hunger or this desire to eat human brains, which is usually a part that you just have somebody like drooling and running through the streets, and it's a very powerful conversation between her and her doctor.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
it's I think her realization, the moment that I thought was just really perfect and great, and I I consider this a selling point for the book that people should think about for when I'm trying to convince them that they really want to read this. Is for me that the little detail was that Aaron looks around and sees the nurse with the taser take a step closer and just realizing, oh shit,
Yeah.
I'm in this. And I thought that was an excellent moment that really drew me into the book. I dog-eared the page and kind of made a little pencil mark there of like, come back to this when you're writing about it. Because to me, not having it be somebody running, drooling in the streets, but having somebody just like getting the medical knowledge. It's like when somebody is being told, like, I'm sorry, you have cancer or you have all these things. And that's something people can relate to. And it makes it more heartbreaking and personal entry into this apocalypse. So well done.
Thank you.
um, and so I didn't want to discuss that in spoilers. I wanted to put that out there as like
Mhm.
this is a very different entry into that whole, kind of apocalypse story, and immediately made me feel like I was in different shoes. And it was around that time where I kind of I felt I had to resist reading the back cover because I had gotten this far, right? And I was like, all right, like I think I know where this is going. And it's
I
great.
even felt like the I even felt like the back cover gives away more than I'm happy with, but like they had to tell people something, right?
Yeah.
So, I would have liked it in an ideal world for me to just be able to say, just read this book. It's fine. Just don't know anything about it. Just read it. Which, of course, that's not at all how this works. So,
Now, my system, though, and I will put this out there to everybody because my system, I like to when I read about a book and decide I want to read it, I think the fact that my TBR is months deep
mhm.
helps because a lot of times by the time I get to the book that I put on the TBR, I don't remember why I wanted to read it. And a lot
That's
of times
fair.
I'm still able to get to it cold. But the other thing is that's one of the joys of having authors that you're committed to, right?
Mhm.
That like I don't need to read what the newest Joe R. Lansdale book's about. I'm gonna read it, right?
Right.
And so but and that's a good thing about like I usually in my book reviews like try to not say anything about the plot and say this is the point where if you trust me like go into it for I'm telling you to read it for these reasons and I'm not telling you about the plot and then I get into it. But yeah, I think well, and it's great to hear that you got to expand this short story. I'm kind of glad I didn't read the short story though. I'm glad I got to read the novel experience. Um,
Cool. I did try to write the novel in a way that the people who were familiar with the short story were going to get a lot of new stuff, like that it would still be
yeah,
fresh and surprising to them in some ways. They would know certainly where part one was heading. They knew ultimately what was going to happen, but the journey I was hoping was going to be more of a surprise and more like just rewarding than reading the short story alone would be.
right. Well, and yeah, it's a fantastic um expansion of the idea I can tell just from what you're saying about it. So this was so the process start when did the process start of expanding this or writing this novel? It was probably 2022-ish, right?
Yeah, I needed to get it turned in a year before publication, just because of how Tor does things. So I had to get it done early, and most of the writing was in like the 6 months before the deadline. So yeah,
And
we would have been.
and thankfully you had research of living through a pandemic to really help you write this, but I'm sure there was still some research
Oh
in
yeah,
yeah into
as you
yeah.
as you already alluded to, I wanted this to have a nice, chewy science fiction center, and I wanted the science in the novel to hang together as long as was humanly possible. I mean, at a certain point, the novel goes full supernatural horror, and things start happening that are definitely supernatural. They cannot be explained by science. But until we get to that point, I wanted everything to hold together as much as was possible. So, several of my first readers were scientists. I had some medical professionals read it to make sure that the hospital scenes were going to be plausible, and make sure that the nurses and doctors were using correct terminology for things, and etc. So,
All right, so before we get into like an under the hood conversation, let's just talk generally about what you've got going on writing wise in the future. Because this has been out for a little bit. Sorry it took me as long as it did.
no
Um
worries.
I but I also know as a writer that if somebody discovers a book and wants to champion it a little bit later, it's a good time to do it too. Um, so so what's next on the horizon? Is this are you going to expand this world into future books? Because it feels like it could do that. Or are we doing something else next, Lucy?
The next thing that's going to come out from Tor Nightfire is going to be something both very different and similar. It's going to be another cosmic horror novel, but it's going to be historical. And the characters are going to be very different. It's a novel called The Star-Stained Soul. And that is another fix up based on a couple of short stories that I wrote for a couple of anthologies some years back. People might remember the short story The Girl with the Star-Stained Soul, which was in a King in Yellow anthology, and The Abomination of Finsmere, which was in one of the Shadows over Main Street anthologies. I think
And I have
number
read
one.
both of those, and now I'm very
Okay.
excited to look forward to that book. So those are ones I have read. So
Okay.
in those collections. So I think I know where you're going with this, maybe. But I'm
Okay.
sure you'll have some surprises for us. But that's really exciting. So, is that book already in the works, or are you
It's in
currently?
the works. It's basically it's finished, but I'm going back through and making some preliminary changes based on editorial request. One of the things they wanted was for me to age up Penny
Hmm.
because in the short stories she's a teenager and they wanted her to be definitely over 18. And so I've been doing that. That sounds like a deceptively simple thing to do, um, but it requires a little bit more tinkering than you would think.
All right, now I got a couple more questions before we get into spoilers, and we've already talked about the novel a little bit, but we're gonna just because I know sometimes people, if they haven't read the book, they won't get to these parts till afterwards. So I want to do this stuff before we go to the spoilers, and we'll get back to Sister Maiden Monster. If you
Okay.
came here to this podcast or to this video specifically to hear about this novel, don't worry, we'll come back to Sister Maiden Monster. But I want to talk about your influences because as um, speaking as somebody who researches the history of the genre and loves reading about writers, I'm very interested in your influences because specifically, your work has a very old school, weird tales feel as far as like the kind of scope and the cosmic nature of things. However, they're just so grounded emotionally in the characters, and I think that's what makes this novel like really cook. But who are your biggest influences as far as writing that style of cosmic horror? Who excites you when you're reading that type of work?
I've had a lot of influences. When I was first writing horror, Clive Barker was one of my influences. Stephen King. But in terms of people who write weird fiction, Caitlin Kiernan, like I am just a huge admirer of her prose style and also how she constructs her novels because she creates and here I'm talking thinking about books like The Drowning Girl and the Red Tree.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she is really good at carefully structuring a novel that nonetheless projects this feeling of chaos. It's like if you look at the bones, like there's a very careful structure here, but when you're reading it, you're generally reading about an unreliable narrator who's suffering from some sort of mental illness. And it feels like this character is moving through chaos, but that's not actually what's happening. And that to me, that's an interesting sleight of hand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in terms of other people, I mean, there's a lot. And of course, I knew you were going to ask me this, and
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those things. I mean, for me specifically, like that the history of the genre is the one of the huge impetuses of my writing for example for
Mhm.
amazing stories, my column for amazing stories. I write, and for me, and I don't expect everyone else to be as in love with the old the golden age authors and the new wave authors like I am, but um what I kept thinking of is, and whether you've read her or not, but especially being in the Midwest, I just really think of the tradition of Catherine Lucille Moore, who C.L. Moore, who from my home state of Indiana, who was one of the first women to really trailblaze in weird tales and out weirding the guys all the time. And
I have not read her. I will have to read her.
yeah, definitely read her first Weird Tales short story is a vampire short story called Shambleau. It's a classic.
Okay.
But one of the cool things about C.L. Moore was well, she eventually married the science fiction writer Harry Kuttner, and they became a writing
Okay.
team. And
Hmm.
but one of the cool things is they were introduced through letters from Lovecraft, introduced
Oh,
them.
nice. Yeah.
Right. And one of the cool things about C.L. Moore is that when Henry Kuttner first wrote a letter, it was addressed to Dear Mr. Moore. And even though Lovecraft referred to her as Kathy Moore, he didn't notice it. And an interesting thing about those two trivia is that their first date, they went on a blind date with Robert Bloch, was the
Oh,
other
cool.
part of the double date. So not blind date, double date. And Robert
Okay.
Bloch was part of the author of Psycho, was a part of that. But she grew up in Indiana working at an insurance agency. And the only reason why she went by C.L. Moore was not to hide her gender, but to hide the fact that she was moonlighting because she could lose her job
Yeah.
at the
Yeah, I'm
bank.
familiar with this problem.
Yes.
I know a
And
lot of people who are school teachers, and yeah, they don't want their administration to find out they're writing horror.
right, right. And C.L. Moore just I think you'll go nuts when
Okay.
you read this stuff because she was writing like pretty like transgressive, horny, like weird fiction like in the 30s, right? And doing it from the Midwest. So I thought of her a lot when you were
Okay.
when I was reading this. So that's interesting. But and I see the Clive Barker influence certainly, and I see like the body horror of the effect that seeing the fly had on you. So I can see all that, right? And I think one of the things that makes this novel so cool is that um, you know, I think well, it's one thing to write transgressive and gory and all that, but to have a novel that has all those elements but is so well written and has like really highly literate prose is one of the things that we're looking for because people have been chasing that with like your Clive Barkers and stuff like that because
Hmm.
there's so few authors who can balance the prose with the super weird and Lucy, I was very impressed by that. So
Well, thank
well
you.
um, and so now that we got through the influence thing, maybe I'll give the listeners, this is your
If I can
final
if I
spoiler
can interrupt
review.
real quick,
Oh, what do
I
you
do want to
want?
give it I do want to give a shout out to Ray Bradbury because when you're talking about old school influences, Bradbury was a really strong one, certainly when I was younger. And on the science fiction side, Ursula Le Guin. I mean, she's
Yeah.
brilliant. Uh, so it goes all over the place.
Yeah, and on Bradbury, and listeners of this podcast will know that I do this every time Bradbury is brought up. But the Ray Bradbury Center in Indianapolis, everyone should go visit because they moved his office piece by piece from LA to Indianapolis. And you can I sat in his writing chair, and
Ooh,
you can do that. And so, Lucy, that's not a far drive for you. And
that's true.
in Indianapolis, you can also do the Kurt Vonnegut Museum at the same time. And
Ah,
and if you people really want to do it, and they go down to Bloomington, the Lilly Library has a first edition of Frankenstein and a lock of Edgar Allan Poe's hair. So
nice. The
so
Lilly
you can
Library
make a
rocks.
yeah, you can make a very nerdy trip to Indiana, and I'm always promoting my home state for that. So yeah, so is there anything else you want to promote before we get into spoilers, things coming up like appearances and short fiction, anything before we go?
Most of my appearances are going to be here in Columbus. I'm going to be at the Ohio Book Festival this spring, and this summer I'm going to have a presence at the Columbus Book Festival. So, if you're in the area, come by, see me.
Awesome. Shout out to the Midwest.
Yep.
I Indiana was great informative for me, so I understand there's a lot of great writers coming out of the Midwest with Midwest feeling. So, um, all right, so now we're getting into spoilers. So here's your last warning. If you don't want to know we're going to assume that if you have listened past this warning, that you have already read this whole book and nothing we say is going to harm your experience. And this is the part where we get under the hood and really get into the nuts and bolts of writing. So we can get really super nerdy and detailed about process here if you want, Lucy.
All right.
Um,
Sure.
I love this part. So the three acts structure and doing this.
Hmm.
So obviously the reveal that of Gregory's involvement in the second act is something that we're going to talk about. But this first act, and you said you expanded this whole idea of the marriage proposal,
Hmm.
because I think the marriage proposal is really what makes the power of the first act really work, because we're invested right from the beginning in this relationship between Gregory and Aaron, because he proposes to her, she accepts, gets sick, and then the whole time we're not just worried about is Aaron going to be healthy or sick. We're constantly worried about when is Gregory gonna like lose patience? When is he gonna
Yeah.
leave? And that whole situation. So you said you added this from the short story. How intentional was it to have that be like kind of a spine or backbone of that first act from the beginning? Because
Uh,
it seems like it
in
was.
the rewrite, it was pretty deliberate because I knew that Erin's story was going to be strongly driven by her relationships and lack thereof.
Mm.
So losing Gregory is pretty central to what happens to her in a psychological sense, maybe not in a physical sense. Maybe whether he left or not was not going to matter in terms of her physical disintegration. But in terms of her character arc, it's really, really important.
And Gregory doesn't like immediately like, oh, you're infected, I'm out. Like, he seems to be doing the right things, but
Yeah.
and what I thought was really good about their dynamic in this situation is that you could actually understand why Gregory would be afraid and
Hmm.
and not want to be a part of it. So there, you know, you feel for Aaron because you understand why she wouldn't want him to leave, but you could also
Hmm.
understand Gregory's position, and I think the push and pull of that was very important to that first act.
Yep, it definitely was. And I introduced Savannah as an idea there in that first chapter as well. And I don't know how many people are going to put it together, but Gregory was actually infected several weeks before Aaron ever was. He's been an asymptomatic carrier throughout most of the book, but then he eventually does start showing symptoms.
Right.
Uh,
And I did not catch that at first. It's something that later on I figured out, and that's something we'll talk
yep,
about. Talk well, we might as well talk about now the reveal.
sure.
So the reveal that um, that Gregory has the secret life, that he's been going to Savannah, and he's been doing these things, and that he was infected first. Um, yeah, that reveal worked very well for me. I was reading, I read during my bus commute to
Hmm.
work, and I was sitting next to my coworker who rides the same bus as me, and there was a moment with the reveal where I literally was just like, and she was like, "What?" And I was like, "It's too hard to explain." I was like, "This book just got me though." And the reveal that Gregory was involved at all in the what I think is great is that, and this is a great literary or storytelling technique, is that by introducing Savannah and making me feel like, oh, we're into a different story now, I forgot about Gregory. And I
Hmm.
wasn't expecting Gregory to pop up. And so when he did pop up, it was the shock of, oh, he's there. And then as I was reading, I started to rethink the implications of what that meant and
Yep.
what how he was involved. So it was like kind of sinking in as I was reading it and thinking like, oh, I'm gonna have to go back and look. And then not and also rethinking for myself, like, oh, did I miss this? Or oh, Lucy, you tricked me. And I was very happy about it, was that I thought that was a great reveal. And that's when a book is really working. So I don't know how much of that was I just wanted you to know it worked
Cool.
in
Very
that
cool.
regard. And understanding that the reveal of that really just makes the whole first act totally different, right? Um
Hmm.
and so how much of that reveal did you dial back some of the clues in the first act, or did you allow them to be there, assuming that we're not looking for them necessarily.
Once I knew what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it, because the problem is, I did want to adhere to one I guess, convention of novels, which is you try to introduce all your main characters as early as possible.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, the whole first part's going to be from Erin's perspective. Um, Savannah is not going to be known to her, but she's known to Gregory.
Mm.
And Moreva isn't known to Gregory, but she could be one of Erin's coworkers. So I do obliquely introduce the other two characters early on, but probably a lot of people have forgotten about it by the time they get to the other parts. But at least I did get them in there.
Yeah.
And I knew Gregory was going to be an instigator for both part one and part two, and indirectly for part three.
Yeah. And how much do you think that kind of reveal with Gregory, it changes how we view the character, but of course we know he's presenting himself to uh we're seeing him through Erin's point of view and the way he wants her to see him, right?
Yeah,
So that
Gregory
go ahead.
Gregory is not a bad guy. He ends up doing some stuff that's really, really damaging, like hugely damaging. He's not trying to do the wrong thing. He's very, very focused on doing what he's been told the right thing to do and to be is, but he can't actually be that guy. That's not who he is, but he can't be honest with himself about who he is and what he wants. And so he ends up living this double life. Um, but he's doing his level best to try to be the guy that he's been told he's supposed to be, but it's just starting to break down. But he can
Yeah.
never be honest with Erin about that.
And so one of the other interesting relationships, and I get the impression that this was more of a big deal in the short story, is the relationship between Betty and
Yep.
Erin. And so the short story, did it have those details with the type 2 and type 3, or was that an
Hmm.
expansion? Okay.
Yep,
Yeah.
that was always there.
Okay. Yeah. And so the different levels of like contamination and Betty making the decision that she's willing to um or at least I got the impression that she's willing to become a type 3 um to be available to Aaron was an interesting part of the story. And it's funny because my reaction to that part was, oh no, don't do that. Don't do that. But you want to have those parts. And so I'm wondering, like, you know, I don't know if was that what you wanted the reader to feel, or did you really want the reader to feel that Betty was doing this out of love? Because I wasn't quite sure about Betty's motivations at that point. Like, she
Betty's motivations are complicated.
yeah,
We find out later that Betty's been seeing other people, but that's not part of the narrative really. But there's the surgery scene, and then there's the scene in the hotel room,
yeah,
where they're just meeting for the rendezvous, and then things really start going off the rails for Aaron. Um, Betty didn't transform herself except for getting the surgery. She was always infected in the way that she was, but her reasons for doing that are a little complicated.
yeah, yeah. Well, and a good and interesting character, and I like the aspect that she was involved by being kind of this ride share driver who
Hmm.
caters to the infected was a really interesting thing because uh I had COVID if for my second bout a couple of weeks ago,
Oof.
and it only hit me for one day, but we had one student who at the school I work at who gave it to like six of us. And
Oh no.
the funny thing was he was wearing a mask all day
Oh
long,
no.
and we most of us were too. at school, and we still all got it. Um, and one of the things that happened, we were talking about, like, once we all knew we were infected that day, and like there was, or that we had been exposed to it, there was a certain degree of like, well, too late now. Right?
Let's just take
Like,
off the mask. Let's have a party,
yeah, we're all too late now. We've all been exposed. And then and I had this, feeling of understanding where Betty was coming from, of like, oh, I'm already a type 2, so I might as well have this job and do this thing. And then
Mhm.
her relationship with Aaron, I thought it was a good one. I think I was more kind of dialed into, it's interesting, I was more dialed into the Gregory thing, because I think the ongoing thing of like wondering when he was gonna like finally come to his wits ends with this situation
Mhm.
was something that I kind of related to, or just like that really strung me along in the book. I don't know.
Okay.
But um my but what I'm saying about it is that, or one of the things I want to say about that in this book, is that the characters are all very strong, and as weird as everything is, it wouldn't work if we didn't have like characters where we're talking about, discussing their motivations, and Betty, well, I don't totally understand what she's doing. Like, I thought a lot about her motivations while reading it. So
Okay.
well done.
Yeah. Thank you. I did want Betty to remain a little bit of a cipher, since we are never inside her head. I mean, Aaron is kind of, but the rest of us aren't. And it sort of goes back to the whole issue of you can't really know another person's motivations,
Yeah,
until you're absolutely, reading their thoughts. People are having to guess at what other people's motivations are. um like Gregory's being as honest as he can be about his motivations, but he's not being honest at all,
right. Well, yeah. And
and
Savannah's,
he doesn't realize it. He thinks he's being honest, but he isn't.
yeah. And I do this sometimes. I'll peep a little bit of the book reviews that are out there before I start writing mine. I wouldn't want to get too much of their thoughts coloring mine, but
Right.
sometimes, but this one, Savannah, was interesting because I knew right away. Now, when you write weird books like you do, Lucy, and you write messed up characters like Savannah, you know that there are some people that are going to have a hard time with a
Hmm.
character like Savannah. And for me, like I've said a couple times, it's a feature, not a bug. For me, that Savannah being a complicated character is one of the things that makes her a fascinating character in this book. But some people, some readers are going to bounce off a character like Savannah hard.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so Savannah was really, because I remember, well, when I was reading this book, there were a few times with Savannah where I laughed out loud and said, "Well, she's going there." And Savannah is a character that, for example, like, I know my wife, if she read this book, she wouldn't be able to hang with some of the things that are going on with Savannah. And
Mhm.
I think that's one of the things that makes her so interesting. So let's get into Savannah.
Okay.
Um, she is a sex worker and comes at these things from a unique perspective.
Hmm.
But I think the thing that makes her so transgressive is this idea that she um, can't really become sexually excited until she discovers that violence, as a part of that act, becomes a thing that drives her, shall we say. Um,
After she's infected. Before she's infected, things are relatively okay, but
yeah,
after she becomes infected, it becomes a problem.
right. And it's important to note that that is a part of the disease, not
Yep.
who she was as a person before.
But she's,
And
well, with Savannah, I want there to be some ambiguity over whether the disease is driving her to do this and she can't control it, or if she's making a deliberate choice. She's
Right.
looking at the choices that are before her, and she's like, okay, I'm choosing to do this thing even though I know better,
Right.
so I want there to be some tension there.
Well, and a sad reality of psychosexual predators and is that the majority of 99.9999% are men. And so to have a situation with a woman in this situation is unique, but also, I think the disease, it's important to note that the disease is a part of the driving factor uh, for this. But and certainly the scene where because as a sex worker, she's involved with this. There's I'd say the scene with I don't and I've got it right here in front of me. I'm trying to see the guy's name. The was it Michael the monk?
The
Uh
monk, yeah.
yeah. Obviously this is a brutal and very frank scene. I would say this is where the novel gets most transgressive.
Hmm.
And so talk about going there because I mean, you obviously made the decision like I'm going there with this novel. Like, what's the thought process behind that aspect of this novel? Because as a writer, I kind of understand going there, but I don't write in that type of extreme horror very often. So,
Well, part of it is a matter of deliberate escalation of the novel.
mhm,
Like, I can't have the brain licking scene in part one be the most extreme moment of horror in the whole book, right?
right,
Like, I can't have that be like the big thing, because that happens relatively early on. So I knew, okay, this is kind of like the midpoint. Where do I go from here? So part of it was just a matter of upping the stakes, upping the situation. Um, another part of it was looking at Savannah and who she is and what would she decide to do under the circumstances. And I knew that she kind of needed to, I guess, get her source of visions, as it were. And I'm like, who could that be? And I happened to learn about a monastery that's here in town that I had no idea existed. And I'm like, really? Right in the middle of the city? That's interesting. And then I
yeah,
was like, huh, that's really interesting. What would Savannah do with this information? Or, how might she meet somebody from there? Uh, speaking of people who choose to do things that maybe they're not supposed to be doing.
right,
Um, so, and, once I had that kind of in my mind, I just didn't fade to black. I just played the scene out in a fairly straightforward fashion from Savannah's perspective. Another mitigating factor was that when I was reading this book, I had been sent a copy of Gretchen Felker Martin's Manhunt to read. And I was kind of reading her book going, oh, that's what kind of party Tor Nightfire's throwing. I don't have to hold anything back at all. So it's just up to me.
right. And well, you certainly didn't hold back, at least as far as I could tell. So,
Okay.
yeah, this is, and yeah, it is rare for it's hard for me as a lifelong horror reader to really be disturbed or to cringe very often. Having read Barker since I was in eighth grade, but there's definitely there's some moments there, and I think part of it too is just how frank it is. When Savannah's kind of offhandedly in the narration talking about like, well, I don't want to end up with rectal tears or have to go to the hospital and all that. And with I think part of what makes it feel so gross is that she's so matter of fact about some of these things, right? And
Yep.
yeah, and definitely yes, definitely worked. It was definitely a brutal scene. And yeah, you're right. That is the party that Tor Nightfire's throwing. So jump right in. Um, yeah, and so Savannah is a fascinating character. How much did she change from her appearance in this original short story to being melded into this novel? Did they always take
Uh,
place in the same universe, or
they did. I had it in my head that I thought, okay, this is an interesting sort of scenario world, however you want to describe it. So let me just, do something from the perspective of somebody else who's caught up in all this, somebody very different from Aaron,
yeah?
and kind of go with it. And then a lot of the novel was expanding upon the loose threads that I'd left and connecting the dots and making sure it ended up in a place where I wanted it to.
You know what
But
you know what I want if you write a sequel, or the character who I'm really fascinated by is the gunman standing sitting on the roofs shooting infected. Like, who clocks in every day to do that job and clocks out. And that I there you mentioned that, these shooters up on top of the roof, and that got my writer brain going a little bit, and I was like, oh,
okay,
I hope one day Lucy like addresses those guys, because
okay, interesting.
it's a very because it was just offhandedly mentioned, but it was just a thing. I was like, who's doing that? And I think part of how Savannah happens is you start thinking, who's doing that? What are the sex workers doing in this
Yep.
future? Like, and so that's one of the fun thought experiments with these things is for writers is you start
Hmm.
thinking like, who works in the restaurants, who works at the, what happened to the librarians during this time or whatever,
Yep.
and so Savannah really plays off the what happened to the sex workers, and you get into a lot of, you obviously thought out a lot about like how they would try to make things safe, how they would try to mitigate these things, and so um, I am kind of interested in like, what was your process for for thinking all that stuff out, because I do think that that's what made Savannah so interesting, is because I did really get invested in like, oh, how is she navigating this? How's she doing this? But
Part of it is that I've had a friend who worked in the biz for quite a while. She started out as a stripper and then she moved into sex work, escorting, things like that. And so I've always kind of, well, not always, but I mean, for a couple of decades, she's shared stories about that world. And so I knew of it from her perspective. And I also know that her perspective isn't like universal perspective, but
right.
her situation was very similar to Savannah's in that she had been working customer service jobs, which really sucked. And then she started stripping and she's like, wow, this is way better. Like I have more agency, I have more money. I'm just going to keep doing this and see where it goes. But I also kind of saw how it affected her in terms of making her very, very jaded about the state of humanity because,
Mm.
she wasn't interacting with the best people on the face of the planet on the regular. And that starts to take a toll.
Well, and what you were doing there is what one of the best pieces of advice I got about writing um, was from John Shirley, when he said one of the most important jobs of a writer is to listen. And when you find
Hmm.
somebody who's got a unique and interesting perspective that is outside of your realm, you have to really be tuned to listen, because someday those details are going to be important later, when you're writing characters. And I always, put that away. And so obviously what you were doing was listening, and
Yeah.
it was paying off with Savannah, you know.
And it's hard not to listen. Like those are some interesting stories. Can I share
Right.
kind of a funny tangential story about that?
Sure.
Uh,
Absolutely.
she had she had gotten a gig appearing in a Playboy video, doing some girl on girl stuff, and she gotten her video and she was excited to show it to us, right? And so we're being supportive friends. We're like, okay, yeah, sure, show it to us. And like that got a lot more graphic than I was kind of expecting. And so we were sitting there in rapt embarrassment, and she like suddenly leans forward toward the screen and she's like, huh, I never knew I had a mole there. And we're just like busted up laughing. What it was like, oh wow, okay, this is a lot more awkward when you're watching adult entertainment with like one of the major players like sitting right next to you. Like, what do you say? What do you do? Oh my God, I'm just gonna sit here and smile.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a much more awkward position that I once I watched the one of the last episodes of Battlestar Galactica in a theater with Katie Sackhoff one row in front of
Oh
me,
wow.
and that was really awkward with Starbuck on the screen, and that's nothing compared to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so you know, I can't even imagine. That's really weird. Okay, so let's get into the third act.
On that
Yeah,
note, let's move forward.
let's move forward from that. The third act is where it gets cosmic and supernatural. And again, this might be a situation where some readers might bounce off of this because you've been setting up a very science fictional thing through the first two acts. And I highlighted this because I saw when I was looking at reviews that a few people did, few people that I read reviews of did bounce off the fact that it got
Mhm.
that the tones shifted. But for me, that worked. Um, I mean, I will admit that when it got really weird and supernatural, that I did have the experience of going, okay, we're going here now. We're going to this place, and and I could understand why some people might feel that way, but I think all the ingredients are there, and all the things that the little hints and clues are there, and you've got people hungry for brains in a in a science fiction novel. Once you've made that leap, like why not be able to go all the way there, right?
Right.
And I personally, I'm a fan of cosmic horror, so I
It works, you know.
yeah, and and my personal feeling is that I like when a novel kind of challenges me with like a switcheroo and a thing like that. So for me, that worked. But you had to know you were taking a risk by doing that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and that some readers just weren't gonna get it. So I'd imagine like when I make decisions like that, when I'm writing, I just say to myself, well, I know I'm going to lose some people here, but that's okay because this is what I want to do. Was that the thought process on that third act, or
Yeah, I knew that I kind of knew where needed to end up, and the intersection of science and the supernatural was always baked into the original short stories, particularly Magdala Magdala.
yeah,
That story was more, the short story itself was more clearly about the main characters sort of leaving behind logic and giving herself over to faith for better and probably for much worse. And, you know, that type of thing. So I knew that at a certain point, things were going to become very magical, for lack of a better term. But also, the other piece was that I've been playing around with the tropes of vampires and zombies in the original short story, and then, of course, in part one. And then the question is, okay, but why? Why that?
yeah.
Why are people transformed in this way? What is the purpose of that? And then you find out the purpose of that, you know, for the archivists and things like that. So you learn why you know, the alien gods are doing what they're doing. We don't know exactly what they're doing with that information that they're gathering, with those experiences that they're gathering, because that, again, that's not part of what the characters are experiencing. But it was always headed in that direction.
Yeah, and I think all the seeds are there. So some of the people that and most of the reviews are very good. There's a lot of really good
Mhm.
reviews out there, but it's just funny to me because I know this happens. It happens to all writers. Like my book Last Night to Kill Nazis. Like, um, I mean, literally, we put a vampire on the cover. It's clearly a vampire novel, but
Mhm.
I have seen comments where like, oh, there's a vampire, and it's like, well, yeah, the vampire killing Nazis was the whole idea,
Yeah.
right? And so I don't understand how the archivist thing could be a turnoff for this book for me, but I could see for some people if they got into the vibe or whatever, I guess, but it doesn't make sense to
Mhm.
me. For me, it totally works. For me, but I just and it's not saying it as a negative thing. It's like liked that you were going there, you know? So
Hmm.
I just know as a writer what that means, right? You know, the what you're doing and holding that back until that point, to me is what works, but I know some readers are just going to bounce off of that and there's nothing you can do about that, right? But to
Yeah,
me,
I
that's
knew that going in, you
yeah,
know.
yeah. And to me, that works because to me, this, the reveal of the archivist was another point of the book where I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, cool. We're going there. We're doing this,
Hmm.
And then, as somebody who currently is teaching Philip K. Dick's writing formula,
Hmm.
right? One of his writing formulas is to have three themes. Every novel has to have three throughout themes. And what I really liked about your novel is that each of the acts of the book kind of have different themes and different feelings and present almost different experiences, but they're all woven together. And that's what I think is so
Hmm.
genius about it. So I think it's a genius thing. I think it's great. It's one of the reasons I gave the book 5 stars. So, and that's why I think it works. But also, I appreciate when an author is willing to take a risk, step out to the edge. And I think it does both those things. So kudos.
Thank you.
And so I'm wondering how you feel about you hear me say like they have all three parts have a different feeling to it. They're all woven together, but are you comfortable? I'm wondering if you're comfortable with them having a different feeling or um or is that kind of an accidental thing? Like,
No, that was deliberate. I mean,
okay,
that was deliberate. I knew that I needed to do my level best to distinguish these women and their voices. And I know for some readers, I didn't do that well enough. Other readers think I did a good job at that. Again, it's eye of the beholder stuff. But I did want each
I think you
part to
did great.
be, well, thank you. Uh, but I wanted each part to be a very different experience. I wanted the shift between the parts to be deliberately a little bit jarring, because that's kind of what keeps happening when you're having a disaster happening, is that stuff keeps happening and you're not prepared for it and you don't know what's going on, and it takes a while to get used to whatever the new normal is, and then that keeps shifting. So that was kind of part of the pandemic experience that I was trying to bring to the page. uh, but I also did want the book to be kind of a mosaic experience from these three people who have some similarities. I mean, all three of them are nerds. All three of them are smart, but they have very different lives.
Mm. Yeah, and you combined cosmic horror, you combined science fiction, you combined you know, body horror and made and all these visceral elements with a very character driven story. And so and what's kind of cool about it is they all weave the stories all weave together, they all make sense together, but you kind of get three different feelings from them, and that's
Mhm.
almost like like a bonus that they don't all feel like one experience. It almost feels like three different experiences. And that's a neat magic trick, narrative magic trick. So very, very impressive, Lucy. And I'm sorry to say this is the first time I've read one of your full-length works, but it will not be the last. And you totally won me over with this. I guess we have my student to thank who sat down in
Yes.
front of the bookshelf. If he had not sat down here, we might not be having this conversation. Uh, and I hope, well, and as far as my listeners who are readers and I mean who are writers, that there's a lot to learn from like I like when I know I'm in good hands with a writer who's like spinning lots of plates and narratively and bringing it all home. And one of the reasons why I liked Sister Maiden Monsters so much was that I felt like I was in good hands. And as somebody who is not a pantser, as an outliner, I know you said you're somewhere in between.
Mhm.
I like when I feel like I'm in a structure that's thought out and and coming together. And one of the things I love about this novel is that it felt like it really came together. So that's a whole lot of me talking about why this book is good. Do you have anything else you want to say about to close out, you know, what was what was your favorite narrative discovery of Sister Maiden Monster before we go?
Um,
That's a big word. That's a big question, but
that's a big question. There were a lot of pleasant surprises in here. Moreva's story didn't go where I originally thought it was going to go, which is fine. Like when I started writing her, I'm like, all right, I want to do something a little bit different than when I was, kind of noodling around with this just as a potential outline on the page. But like Baby Gregory was kind of a fun surprise. He kind of took on more of a life of his own. Expanding Savannah's story was more fun than it probably should have been. I feel a little guilty about that, but Savannah is a polarizing character. I mean, when I was on my book tour, I met a lot of people who were like, she was definitely their favorite character. And I'm like, that's cool, but maybe she shouldn't be. I don't know.
yeah, maybe not. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I really enjoyed the experience of reading this with no idea where it was going or where it was starting. So and I, like I said, I went on the strength of reputation and was very well rewarded for having experience of like not reading the dust jacket and all that. So um and yeah, and it was a great bus commute read. Definitely
Excellent.
almost missed my stop once reading this book.
Uh-oh.
You can feel good about that. Anything else you want to leave the super nerds with who've made it this far?
Uh, Everything I wrote about Pandora viruses in the book is real.
Okay.
If you haven't looked that up, look those up. Those are so cool and so weird.
Right. Real body horror shit.
Yep.
Yeah. Again, Lucy, fantastic job. If anybody's made it this far, you're a super nerd. I love it. Hope to see folks in Indiana on April 7th for the People's Park book release party. For those, this is a coming of age sci-fi horror novel. It's the first one I wrote after starting to do a bunch of research on Philip K. Dick, and so it's very PKD inspired, and but with skateboards and punk rock and summer of 1989 in Indiana. So a lot
Excellent.
of the real life folks who I turned into characters are going to be at that book release party. So it's going to be a little bit of a reunion because People's Park in Bloomington that inspired this novel is
Hmm.
the I wanted to write a book about the places where freaks and weirdos gathered before the internet.
Hmm. Yep.
And that park was the place in my hometown. And what I discovered, I didn't know this when I was growing up there, that the whole reason the park exists in the middle of downtown Bloomington is it used to be a black owned business and it was bombed by the Klan. And
Oh, dang.
yes, and in 1969, the hippies took over and said, we're going to turn this into a park, a symbol of peace and unity. And I grew up hanging out in that park and never knew that history
Oh,
until
wow.
a few years ago. And so this is the inciting incident of this novel. And I hope people will check it out April 7th in Bloomington, Indiana, if you're in the Midwest. But you can order a special edition of it to be mailed. So if people want to get it there, and do that. And of course, my book, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, is close to this book on the shelves at Barnes and Noble. So you can, when you go to pick up Sister Maiden Monster, if you haven't already gotten my novel, Last Night to Kill Nazis, it's vampire killing Nazis, go do that too. So thank you, Lucy, for your time. You were awesome. I hope Everybody enjoyed getting the nuts and bolts of this, and I'm sure I will have you back at some point to talk about future works because I'm excited about the next one because I've read the stories that fed into that one. So
Very cool. I'm glad you're excited for it.
all right, so folks, thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time. I believe the next episode is going to be Lavi Tidar talking about his new novel, Circumference of the World. So that should be next. Thanks for joining us.